My parents tried to destroy my marriage because of my fiancé's past. Now they're desperate for my money after seeing me thrive. I've always been the type of guy who tried to live up to family expectations. Growing up in a middle-class suburban home, my parents, Richard and Diane, raised me to believe in things like hard work, respectability, and sticking to tradition. They weren't bad people, strict, sure, but their rules came from a place of wanting the best for me and my sister, Emily. I followed the path they laid out for me, went to college, landed a steady job in finance, and stayed out of trouble. My life was fine. Safe, even. But it was also kind of ordinary. Then I met Heather. We were introduced through mutual friends at a dinner party. She wasn't the kind of person I usually clicked with, outgoing, sharp-witted, and completely unfiltered. But there was something about her energy that drew me in. By the end of the night, we were swapping stories, laughing like old friends, and I couldn't believe how easy it was to talk to her. Dating Heather felt like a breath of fresh air. She had this way of making life seem bigger and brighter, and for the first time, I wasn't just going through the motions. We talked about everything, our goals, our struggles, and the things that shaped us into who we were. A few months into our relationship, Heather sat me down and told me something personal about her past. Back in her early 20s, when she was struggling to make ends meet, she'd worked as an escort for a short time. It wasn't a decision she was proud of, but it wasn't one she was ashamed of either. It had been a part of her life, and she wanted me to know. Hearing it was a shock, sure. But the way she told me, with honesty and no excuses, showed me exactly why I loved her. Heather wasn't defined by her past. She was defined by the way she faced it, learned from it, and moved forward. By the time I proposed to her a year later, I knew I'd found the person I wanted to spend my life with. What I didn't know was how hard my parents were about to make things. For months after our engagement, everything felt perfect. Heather and I were planning a small, intimate wedding, something meaningful, not extravagant. I knew introducing her to my parents would be tricky, but I naively hoped they'd see what I saw, someone genuine, caring, and incredibly strong. Things were fine at first. My mom seemed polite, even a little warm, when she met Heather. My dad was quieter, more reserved, but that wasn't unusual for him. I thought we were making progress. That illusion shattered when my dad got a phone call. Apparently, someone in their church circle had heard a rumor about Heather's past. I don't know how the gossip started, maybe someone recognized her, maybe it was pure coincidence, but by the time it reached my dad, the story was fully formed. When I came over for dinner one weekend, I knew something was off the moment I walked in. My mom wouldn't make eye contact, and my dad was unusually stiff. After dinner, they sat me down in the living room and dropped the bombshell: they knew about Heather. The way they talked about it was cruel, as if they'd uncovered some great betrayal. My dad kept saying things like, "How could you not tell us?" and "Do you even know what this will do to our reputation?" My mom just looked at me, her face full of disappointment, like I'd done something shameful by loving her. I tried to defend Heather, explaining that she'd been honest with me from the start and that her past didn't change who she was. But it was like talking to a wall. To them, this wasn't about Heather as a person, it was about their image, their standards, and how my decision reflected on them. By the time I left that night, I realized my parents weren't interested in understanding. They'd already made up their minds. After that confrontation, my parents ramped up the pressure immediately. My dad, Richard, took the direct approach. He started calling me almost daily, lecturing me about how marrying Heather would bring shame to the family. He'd talk about legacy, values, and how important it was to marry the right kind of person. The right kind, apparently, didn't include someone with Heather's past. My mom, Diane, was more subtle, but her guilt-tripping was relentless. She'd send me long, emotional texts about how heartbroken she was, how she'd raised me better, and how disappointed she felt. "I just don't understand why you're doing this to us," one message read. Even my sister, Emily, joined in. She wasn't outright hostile like my parents, but her comments cut deep in their own way. "You know they're just worried about you," she'd say. "They just want what's best." She acted like their judgment was somehow rooted in love, as if that made their behavior acceptable. The constant barrage left me drained. I felt like I was stuck in the middle, pulled between my parents' expectations and my love for Heather. On one hand, I didn't want to lose my family. On the other, I couldn't imagine my life without Heather. The worst part was the way they talked about her, as if she wasn't even human, just some scandal that needed to be erased from my life. It made me furious, but it also made me doubt myself. Was I being selfish? Was I ruining my relationship with my family for something that would never work? Heather noticed the change in me. I tried to keep it from her, but I wasn't doing a great job. One night, she sat me down and asked if I was having second thoughts. That was the moment I realized I had to make a choice, not just for Heather, but for myself. I couldn't keep living in this limbo. That conversation with Heather was a wake-up call. She didn't push me to choose her outright, but she made it clear that she wouldn't stay in a relationship where she felt like a constant source of conflict. "I love you," she said, "but I can't be with someone who's ashamed of me." Hearing her say that broke something in me. I wasn't ashamed of Heather, not for a second. What I was ashamed of was letting my parents get under my skin and make me question the best thing in my life. The next time my dad called, I told him we needed to talk face to face. When I showed up at their house, my mom tried to greet me with that same sad, disappointed expression she'd been wearing for weeks. My dad wasted no time diving into his usual speech about how I was making a huge mistake. But this time, I didn't let them steamroll me. I told them I loved Heather and that her past didn't matter to me. I said she'd been honest, upfront, and more courageous than anyone else I'd ever known. "I'm marrying her," I said. "And nothing you say is going to change that." My dad's face turned red. He started yelling about how I was throwing away everything they'd taught me. My mom chimed in, her voice shaking, about how devastated she was. It was like they didn't even hear me. When they started to double down, I told them something I'd been holding back for a long time: this isn't about Heather. It's about control. You don't like that I'm making a decision you can't dictate, and that's why you're upset. The room went silent. My dad stared at me like I'd slapped him. My mom's eyes filled with tears, but this time, I didn't backtrack or apologize. I told them that I loved them, but if they couldn't accept Heather, they wouldn't be a part of my life, or our future. I left that day knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. After that confrontation, things went from tense to unbearable. My parents didn't just disapprove of my decision, they made it their mission to change my mind. My dad stopped calling entirely, which, at first, felt like a relief. But he wasn't just giving me space. Instead, he started working through Emily, my sister. She'd call or text every few days, urging me to reconsider. "Dad's really upset," she'd say, or, "Mom's been crying all week. Can't you at least think about how this is affecting them?" My mom, on the other hand, ramped up her efforts. She sent me long emails, pulling every emotional card she could think of. She talked about how she'd always dreamed of my wedding day, how she'd hoped to help plan it, and how devastated she was that I was choosing someone over family. It hurt, hearing her frame it that way. I wasn't choosing Heather over them, I was choosing Heather with the hope they'd accept her. But every word they said made it clear that wasn't an option. Then, they escalated. My dad sent me a message that hit me like a gut punch: "If you go through with this marriage, you're on your own. Don't expect our support, financial or otherwise." It wasn't about money, I was financially independent and hadn't needed their help for years. But the message behind it, that they were willing to cut ties completely, left me reeling. I started to feel like I was losing them for good. Family had always been a cornerstone of my life, and now it felt like that foundation was crumbling beneath me. At the same time, I couldn't bring myself to regret my choice. I knew Heather deserved better than to be treated like some shameful secret, and I wasn't about to abandon her to make them happy. But no matter how firm I tried to stay, the emotional weight of their rejection was heavier than I expected. The weeks after my parents' ultimatum were some of the hardest of my life. Every day felt like a test of my resolve. My dad's silence was deafening, and my mom's constant guilt-tripping wore me down. Even Emily, who I thought might understand, kept pushing the idea that I should rethink everything and make peace while I still could. But the more I thought about it, the clearer my choice became. Heather wasn't just my fiancée, she was my future. She'd shown me a kind of love and loyalty I'd never experienced before. And in her eyes, I saw everything I wanted: honesty, partnership, and a life built on something real. One night, as we sat on the couch planning the wedding, Heather hesitated. She looked at me and said, "Mark, if this is too much, I'll understand. I won't blame you if you need to walk away." Hearing her say that broke my heart. She wasn't trying to manipulate me or guilt me into staying, she was giving me an out, even though I knew it would devastate her. That was the moment I knew I couldn't waver anymore. I told her, "I'm not going anywhere. You're my family now." With that decision came a sense of clarity. I couldn't force my parents to accept Heather, and I couldn't keep living my life to meet their expectations. If they chose to cut ties, that was their choice, but I wasn't going to sacrifice my happiness for their approval. From that moment on, I poured everything into building our future. Heather and I finalized our wedding plans, booked the venue, and sent out invitations, knowing full well my parents wouldn't be there. It was bittersweet, but it was also freeing. The day of our wedding was one of the most beautiful, and emotionally complicated, days of my life. Heather looked stunning, and seeing her walk down the aisle felt like the culmination of everything we'd fought for. But there was also a heaviness in the air, a quiet ache that lingered in the background. My parents weren't there. Neither was Emily. I had held on to a slim hope that they might show up last minute, that some part of them would put love over judgment. But their chairs remained empty. Instead, the seats were filled with people who truly supported us, friends, colleagues, and a few distant relatives who'd reached out after hearing about the conflict. They all showed up, cheering us on and reminding me that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who choose to stand by you. During the reception, I made a speech. I didn't plan to bring up my parents, but the emotions were too raw to ignore. I thanked everyone who came for celebrating our love and standing with us. Then, I addressed the absence. Today is about building a life with someone I love. It's about moving forward, even when it's hard, and I couldn't be prouder to marry Heather. I saw tears in Heather's eyes as I spoke. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't losing a family, I was building one. After the wedding, Heather and I went on a small honeymoon. We spent the week exploring quiet beaches, laughing, and planning the life we wanted together. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. But returning home brought reality crashing back. A pile of unopened messages from my mom was waiting for me, and they weren't congratulatory. Coming home from the honeymoon felt like stepping into a storm. My mom had sent message after message, some long and dramatic, others short and biting. There was no congratulations, no acknowledgement of our marriage, just more guilt. She wrote about how I had betrayed the family and how heartbroken they all were. One message stuck with me: "I don't know how you can call yourself our son after doing this to us." It hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad's silence continued, but his absence spoke volumes. It was like he was making a point: if I wanted to be part of the family, I had to come crawling back on their terms. Emily reached out once, and I thought maybe she wanted to bridge the gap. But instead, she just echoed my parents' sentiments, accusing me of choosing someone over the people who raised me. It felt like she had become their mouthpiece, repeating the same lines about legacy and shame. I tried to focus on Heather and our new life together, but the weight of their words lingered. I started questioning myself in quiet moments. Could I have handled things differently? Was I really being selfish, as they claimed? Heather noticed. One night, while we were eating dinner, she gently put her hand on mine and said, "Mark, you can't let them control you from a distance. They've already made their choice, you have to make yours." She was right. I couldn't keep letting their judgment dictate how I felt about myself or my marriage. If they couldn't accept Heather, that was on them. But letting their words take up space in my head, that was on me. I decided then and there to stop engaging with the guilt campaign. I didn't respond to the messages or try to explain myself further. I had already made my choice, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. Months passed without any real contact from my parents. At first, it was painful. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, filled with unspoken words and the lingering ache of rejection. But as time went on, the pain started to dull, replaced by a growing sense of clarity. Heather and I poured ourselves into building our life together. We focused on our careers, saved up for a home, and leaned on the people who supported us. Slowly but surely, things started to fall into place. The real turning point came when Heather landed a huge promotion at her job. We celebrated with a small dinner at home, just the two of us, reflecting on how far we'd come. Looking around, I realized we'd built something solid, not just a home, but a partnership built on love, trust, and resilience. It was during that celebration that I noticed how much lighter I felt without the constant pull of my family's expectations. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells or second-guessing myself. I was just living. That realization gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt before. I finally stopped looking at my family's rejection as a reflection of my worth. Their inability to accept Heather said more about them than it did about me or my marriage. But just as we were settling into this new chapter, my mom broke the silence. It started with an email from my mom. It was carefully worded, the kind of message that didn't outright apologize but hinted at regret. She wrote about how much she missed me, how she hoped we were doing well, and how the family wasn't the same without me. I read it a few times, trying to figure out what she really wanted. It felt less like an olive branch and more like bait, dangling just enough sentimentality to lure me back in. I didn't respond right away. A week later, my dad called. Hearing his voice for the first time in months felt strange, like hearing a ghost. He kept the conversation surface level at first, asking about work and making awkward small talk. Then he shifted gears. He mentioned how the house needed some repairs and how things had been tight financially. He didn't outright ask for help, but the implication was clear. It was a pattern I recognized all too well: frame the problem, let the guilt do the rest. I stayed polite but non-committal, ending the call before he could push further. Over the next few weeks, the messages became more frequent. My mom texted asking if I could send some money to help Emily with her college expenses. My dad mentioned how they'd been thinking about downsizing but didn't have the funds to get started. It was subtle at first, but the more I ignored their hints, the more direct the requests became. They weren't trying to reconnect out of love or regret, they were testing the waters to see if I could be useful to them again. That realization hit hard. After everything we'd been through, they still saw me as someone they could manipulate, not as their son. Once my parents realized I wasn't biting, their requests became more demanding. Subtle hints turned into outright pleas, and eventually, those pleas turned into guilt-laden accusations. My mom sent a long text one evening, saying how much she and my dad had sacrificed to raise me and how hurtful it was that I couldn't spare a little to help them now. She brought up specific moments from my childhood, the soccer games they paid for, the vacations we took, like a running tab they were calling in. Not long after, my dad sent an email with a detailed explanation of how much they needed to fix the roof, complete with an invoice. He framed it as if it were my obligation to step in, saying, as the eldest, it's your responsibility to help take care of the family. The breaking point came when they asked me to help them get back on their feet by buying them a new house. My mom wrote an email about how the family home had too many bad memories now and how they dreamed of starting fresh. She attached links to properties they'd been looking at, ones far out of their price range, and asked if I could provide the down payment. It felt surreal. The same parents who had been ready to disown me over Heather were now asking me to bankroll their lives. It wasn't about reconciliation, it was about money. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was time to address everything head-on. After weeks of escalating requests, I decided I couldn't let things drag on any longer. I called my parents and told them we needed to talk in person. Heather wasn't thrilled about me reopening this door, but she understood that I needed closure, whatever that looked like. When I arrived at their house, it was like stepping back into a past I'd worked so hard to move beyond. My mom greeted me with teary eyes, and my dad gave me a stiff nod. Emily wasn't there, which I was grateful for. I didn't want to face her judgment on top of everything else. We sat in the living room, and I didn't waste time. I told them I knew why they had been reaching out and that I needed to set the record straight. I love you both, I said, but I'm not here to fix your roof or buy you a house. I'm here because I want us to be honest with each other. At first, my mom deflected, insisting they just missed me and wanted to rebuild the family. My dad, however, cut straight to the point, saying that family was supposed to support each other, and he couldn't understand why I was being so selfish. That word, selfish, lit a fire in me. I stayed calm, but I told them exactly how I felt. I reminded them of the pain they caused when they rejected Heather, how they made me feel like I had to choose between my wife and my family. I gave you every chance to be part of my life, and you chose your pride instead, I said. Now, you want my help, but you still can't even acknowledge how you treated us. My mom started crying, saying she didn't know how to fix things. My dad, ever stubborn, said they had acted out of love, trying to protect me from a mistake. I told them it wasn't their job to protect me from my own choices, especially not by tearing down the person I love. The conversation ended with me laying down a clear boundary. I wasn't cutting them off completely, but I wasn't going to be their financial safety net. If they wanted to be part of my life, it had to be on terms of mutual respect, not manipulation. As I left, I felt both lighter and heavier. I didn't know if they'd respect my boundaries, but for the first time, I stood up for myself and Heather in a way I hadn't before. After the confrontation, things were quiet for a while. My parents didn't reach out immediately, and for a moment, I thought they might have finally understood my boundaries. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was better than the constant guilt and demands. Heather was supportive through it all, but she could see the toll it had taken on me. I know it's hard, she said one night, but you did the right thing. They need to see that they can't treat you like this anymore. For a few months, we focused on our lives. We bought our first home together, a modest place that we fixed up ourselves, and spent weekends repainting walls, planting flowers, and building a life that felt truly ours. But the peace didn't last. My mom eventually sent me another email, this time framed as an apology. She admitted they might have been too harsh about Heather's past and said they wanted to move forward as a family. For a split second, I felt hopeful. Maybe this was their way of extending an olive branch. Then came the twist. After a few paragraphs of vague reconciliation, she slipped in a request: could I help Emily with some of her college expenses? She framed it as a way to show that I was still part of the family and said it would mean so much to them if I could prove my commitment. I closed the email without responding. It was clear they hadn't changed. They weren't interested in rebuilding a real relationship, they just wanted access to my success under the guise of reconciliation. It hurt, but it also solidified my resolve. I wasn't going to fall back into old patterns. After my mom's email, I realized something important: their attempts at reconciliation weren't about healing, they were about control. For years, they had tried to mold me into someone who fit their ideals. When I didn't, they rejected me. Now, they saw my success as something they could leverage, a way to reassert their influence. I decided to make my boundaries crystal clear. I responded to my mom's email with a simple message. I appreciate your reaching out, but I can't keep having these conversations if they're tied to money or favors. I'm open to rebuilding a relationship, but it has to be based on respect and understanding. I need you to accept Heather and my choices fully. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever written, but it was also freeing. I hit send and braced myself for the fallout. Predictably, my dad called within hours. He was furious, accusing me of turning my back on the family and throwing away everything they'd done for me. I stayed calm, repeating that my decision wasn't about abandoning them, it was about protecting my peace and my marriage. My mom responded differently. She sent a short, curt reply saying she was sorry I felt that way, and that they would always love me, even if I didn't feel the same. It was classic emotional manipulation, but for the first time, it didn't land the way it used to. I'd made my decision. If they couldn't respect Heather and our life together, then I wasn't going to keep trying to force a relationship that only drained me. It's been a couple of years since I set those boundaries with my parents. Looking back, it wasn't easy, but it was absolutely the right choice. Their rejection hurt deeply at first, but over time, I've learned to let go of the guilt and focus on the life I'm building with Heather. Heather and I are thriving. Our marriage is strong, filled with love and mutual respect. We've built a home together, surrounded ourselves with people who genuinely support us, and even started talking about having kids one day. Every step forward has reinforced that the best decisions are the ones made with your values and happiness in mind, not someone else's expectations. As for my parents, contact has been sporadic. My mom occasionally sends holiday emails or cards, but they're always distant and generic. My dad hasn't reached out since that last phone call, and Emily hasn't either. It's sad, but I've come to accept that some relationships can only exist on the terms others are willing to respect, and if those terms are toxic, it's okay to let them go. I don't hate my family. I still care about them in a distant way, and I hope they're doing well. But I've learned that love doesn't mean sacrificing your own happiness or tolerating disrespect. Heather once told me, the people who truly love you will always find a way to support you, even if they don't agree with every decision you make. She was right. I've stopped chasing approval from people who only want me on their terms. Instead, I've focused on building a life filled with love, respect, and honesty. And for the first time, I feel free.